Hello and welcome to our program, In the Know, keeping pace with news and updates on COVID-19 vaccines. The CME program is supported by an educational grant from Janssen Therapeutics. Before we start, please take a moment to answer the pre-polls in the tweets below and let us know who you are. This is a CME certified program. Details regarding how to obtain your credit are located in the tweets below. Be sure to watch our handles for additional CME COVID programming, as this webinar is the first event in a series of 4 activities, and follow at Bonham CE for CME certified programs on Twitter. I'm Dr. Tara Smith. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist at Kent State University in Ohio, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, Drs. Ogbuagu and Dr. Vermund.
Hello, I'm Dr. Onyema Ogbuagu. I'm an associate professor of medicine at the Yale School of Medicine and the section of infectious diseases.
My name is Sten Vermund. I'm a professor and dean at the Yale School of Public Health. I'm a pediatrician and infectious disease epidemiologist.
Our disclosures are shown on your screen. Our program today is the first of 4 events about COVID-19 vaccine news updates. We'll be streaming 3 additional newsroom broadcasts on Bonham CE's Twitter page with further discussion regarding COVID-19 vaccine developments. Over the course of our discussion today, we'll be addressing the following learning objectives: translate the data regarding clinical trial efficacy and real-world effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccines in use in the US, distinguish the data between varying vaccine effectiveness against variants of concern, evaluate data regarding booster doses for the general and special populations, including persons receiving non-US licensed products overseas, review the recommendations for the special patient populations, including case definitions, patient characteristics, and guidance documents. And so these are the topics we will be presenting today. So we'll start with the current state of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there have been almost 80 million COVID-19 confirmed cases in the United States and closing in on 1 million deaths. We are currently in a lull after the large Omicron peak from late 2021 into the start of 2022, but currently still have almost 9,000 individuals hospitalized. And Omicron variant now does constitute about 100% of the new infections that we're seeing in the United States. We have over 80% of those who are eligible, that's ages 5 and over, in the United States, who have received at least 1 dose, with about 217.8 million people fully vaccinated. 98 million have received a booster dose as well. Of course, this varies significantly by age group. In those younger age groups, we have a very low uptake. In the adolescent age group, ages 12 to 17, only about 28% of those are fully vaccinated. And you can see also in middle age groups, from young adults up to about age 49, only about 58 to 66% of those are fully vaccinated. And it's a little bit better in the older age groups, 80% in ages 50 to 64, 65 to 74 are the highest with 91%, and dips a little bit at 75 plus with about 85% of those who are fully vaccinated. It also varies by race and ethnicity. Unfortunately, Black Americans, not Hispanic, who are at a very high risk of serious complications of COVID-19 infections, are the lowest group that is fully vaccinated in the United States, with only 42% of those fully vaccinated. This also varies significantly by geography. You can see in the Northeast and on the West Coast states, those tend to have the most individuals who are fully vaccinated, with much lower levels in the Upper West and Great Plains area and throughout many of the southern states where uptake is much lower. So I'd like to have a little bit of a chat with my colleagues. First, what do you think about COVID-19 going forward from here? Do you suspect that cases are going to increase in the coming days and weeks?
The Omicron BA.2 variant has certainly increased. It's a much larger proportion of all of the cases than the BA.1 variant, and Omicron has virtually completely displaced the ancestral strain and the Delta strain. To date, we don't see BA.2 as escaping immune protection. So those of us who are vaccinated or have had prior COVID do seem to be protected from the ravages of BA.2. But persons who are unvaccinated and who have not gotten prior COVID are at risk. So we are hoping to continue the drumbeat of the positive the merits of vaccination, and whether cases increase will very much depend upon our success rate in expanding vaccines in the parts of the country that you've highlighted are substantially under-vaccinated.
Yeah, and if I might add, I think in the United States, because of the widespread use of home tests that are not necessarily always captured with our surveillance systems, I think that that may somewhat attenuate the number of cases that are being reported with the BA2. And also remember that this is a different time with regards to just the proportion of population that's vaccinated and those that have also received boosters, which also should attenuate the number of cases. But I think we all continue to remain concerned about rising number of cases, given what we're seeing in Europe, including the UK and other parts of the world where BA2, like is currently occurring in the US, where the BA2 has since become the predominant strain circulating.
Dr. Ogbuagu makes a very important point, which is that you have to have an international perspective on this. If we do not do a better job vaccinating the world, then these RNA viruses that have high mutation rates will inevitably generate new variants that could come back and threaten us.
And with that international aspect, do you see any variants that have popped up in other countries that you think we should be, honing in on, looking at for the next, what comes after BA2?
Inevitably, there will be other variants because that's the nature of RNA viruses. And we would do well to maximize coverage rates from vaccination globally.
Yeah, now if I might add, I think that we're seeing the virus mutate, and like Dr. Vermund rightly mentioned, but also we're seeing combination events as well, which appear to be quite rare. We know the UK is recently reporting an XE variant that may be a recombinant of the two different kinds of Omicron subvariants. So I think like we've all mentioned that, again, trying to get as much of the world vaccinated so we can, decrease the amount of circulating virus, both amount in time as well, I think would protect us against a novel variant emerging.
Let's review a little bit of what the impact of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines are on the immune system. There are two ways that you can generate an immune response. That is, either be exposed to the virus itself with its antigenic spike protein on the virus coat, or be vaccinated with the spike protein antigen or the mRNA that codes for production of that antigen. So we much prefer people to be protected from the vaccine than from the disease itself. And that's a generalizable principle for all of the vaccine preventable diseases. We don't use a vaccine if it's not safe and effective at mitigating the harms of the invading virus, bacteria, or other agent. Now, once the antigen has been presented, either through the mRNA that codes to produce the protein antigen, or presenting the antigen itself, as with some of the other products, then you trigger a vigorous T cell response and communication to the humoral B cell system, and you have the memory T and B cells that can provide protection for many months and possibly many years if we have proper boosting. So the reality is that the plasma cells are poised to produce antibodies based on T cell recognition of the invader. And that doesn't happen if you've never seen the antigen before. It takes much, much longer to stimulate an immune response. You have the word amnesia, meaning I forgot. Then you've got the word anamnesia, meaning I remember. And the anamnestic response is what we're looking for, that I remember having seen that antigen before, and I'm going to mount a vigorous immune response against it. One concern is when patients say, well, this vaccine didn't work. I had the vaccine, but I got COVID anyway, or I got flu anyway. And that reflects a misunderstanding of how vaccines work. They're not good at preventing infection. They're good at preventing severe consequences of infection. And that's our goal for vaccination. Now, how COVID vaccines elicit immunity is a complex mechanism. The mRNA is obviously stimulating the cell itself to produce the protein, whereas the AdV vaccine is a more direct presentation of the protein itself. But at the end of the day, the result is the same. One is presenting the antigens of the spike protein to the immune system, enabling it to recognize the invader, to develop the memory to recognize it again, and to turn on the B cells and plasma cells to produce antibody at the right time. Now, there are 3 COVID vaccines available in the US, 2 mRNA products that are produced by Pfizer, BioNTech, and by Moderna, and then the Johnson & Johnson adenovirus recombinant vector vaccine. All of them have similar adverse effects that are common: injection site pain and swelling, perhaps some redness, some fatigue, some headache, some muscle pain, and fever. The rare adverse effects include myocarditis in young men for the 2 mRNAs. This is mild and reversible and rare. And rare clotting events among reproductive age women for the Johnson & Johnson. The consequences of COVID vaccination are trivial compared to the consequences of disease itself, so the cost benefit is unambiguously in favor of vaccination. There are 2 concepts that we promulgate in vaccine research and evaluation. One is efficacy, which is performance under ideal and controlled conditions, such as a randomized clinical trial. The other is effectiveness, and that is measuring how well we do in preventing serious adverse consequences of the infection in real-world conditions. So given all of the challenges in programmatic rollout, how well do we actually influence the disease in real-world conditions? And this is a table that may be of some use to you, comparing efficacy and effectiveness. And as you can see, there isn't a huge difference where we have the data to prevent symptomatic infection. Some of the elements we have clinical trial data, some of them we have real-world data, and at the end of the day, we are extremely pleased with our ability to prevent hospitalization and prevent mortality, which are the most dramatic examples. Now, many of these unavailable statistics simply weren't studied in the clinical trials because they weren't large enough and they weren't continued long enough, but we can secure information from effectiveness studies that suggest the extraordinary nature of these vaccines. Now, we are interested in whether vaccination works as well in persons with substantial comorbidities, such as diabetes or immunosuppressive illnesses. And the prevalence of high-risk comorbidities in clinical trials was substantial. Between 22 and 41% of all the patients who were enrolled in these clinical trials actually had comorbidities. And happily, the preventive effect of the vaccine did not differ in any significant way between persons with and without comorbidities. So the vaccines work just as well in persons with heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and the like as in persons without those conditions. We also are looking at mortality, and obviously COVID-19 mortality is virtually eliminated by vaccination. We are seeing 15, 20 times lower death rates in vaccinated people than non-vaccinated people. But we're interested in knowing whether non-COVID mortality risk might differ. Are there some hidden harms of the vaccine that when we have vaccinated millions of people, we might detect, whereas in the clinical trials of 30,000 people, we might not have detected? And happily, the vaccine recipients actually had lower non-COVID mortality than unvaccinated individuals. This is not statistically significant because deaths are not so common, but if there is any concern about this, the directionality of the association is far in favor of vaccinated individuals, even for non-COVID mortality. And there are a number of reasons for that. So I'll turn it back to Dr. Smith.
So you mentioned that one of the primary goals of vaccination is really to prevent serious illness. Do you think the public understands that as much as you mentioned? People think I was vaccinated for flu, I got flu anyway, the vaccine doesn't work. Is that something that you think there is a misunderstanding out there in the general public?
I hear this all the time, that people have grand expectations of vaccines to actually prevent infection, when our goal for vaccines is to prevent complications from infection. I'd love to hear Dr. Ogbuagu's experience with this.
Absolutely. So I definitely do agree that we're all happy with vaccines that protect against the more consequential effects of the disease. But I think the interest in preventing even infection in and of itself, which could include asymptomatic cases, is just a concern around vaccines mitigating transmission. I think that's where the focus has been. And unfortunately, depending on what we think the goals are, that will determine what drives our decisions around when to boost and who to boost. But I think, as we've put the bar for every other vaccine, I'm satisfied with a vaccine that protects against hospitalizations and death.
But these vaccines do still reduce infection, is that correct?
Absolutely, they do. And we saw a bit of a loss of that difference with regards to the variant of concern that are a little more transmissible. But, even in the Omicron era, we still saw about a 5 times lower amount of infections with vaccinated versus unvaccinated individuals. So some loss of the degree of difference, but still, yes, the vaccines still do protect somewhat against infection and downstream transmission, and that has been showed in some studies as well.
Maybe we could go over what are the primary mode that it does that. Vaccines work both to reduce infections, but also to reduce those severe consequences of infections.
So I think what's clearly emerging as a correlative protection are the circulating neutralizing antibodies. I think it's hard to compare across studies, which vaccine is doing better than another. And then, of course, like Dr. Vermund mentioned during his presentation, the memory responses that are evoked by some of these vaccines also play a role, maybe not as the first line of defense, but a second line that may be more durable line of defense. And all vaccines across all platforms tend to do that pretty well. I know that the J&J vaccine may have a little bit of an edge with regards to T-cell responses, but I think across the board, they both evoke quite a robust responses that are boosted when people receive additional doses. So now in the next series of slides, we're going to be reviewing the effectiveness of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines against existing and new variants of concern, along with some of the data on booster doses. In this slide, we show the COVID variants of concern as they have emerged, and we highlight the time in which they emerged, as well as the locations where the variants were first identified. Across the board, we've seen that as newer variants emerge, they tend to have a competitive edge, if you will, against the preceding variants of concern, such that they appear to be a little more transmissible, spread more easily. We use a term in epidemiology known as RO, or the reproductive number, and we've seen that the newer variants of concern appear to have higher ROs than preceding variants. Some of these variants have emerged on a global scale to become predominant strains, while some have been geographically limited, for example, the beta and the gamma strains. As these variants have emerged, we know that there's always been concern about the ability of these new variants to evade immune responses, such as the beta, gamma, and Omicron, which have shown quite significant immune evasion compared to other variants of concern. And this is important because it does impact the efficacy of vaccines as well as treatments such as the monoclonal antibodies. Now, here are some of the evolving strategies to prevent COVID-19. We know that vaccine effectiveness wanes over time. That's been shown in multiple studies and among multiple cohorts. And in addition to this, we recognize that also some of the variants of concern show immune evasion to primary vaccine series, such that sera from these individuals may not effectively neutralize the variants of concern. And we also have seen, higher rates of breakthrough infections among previous vaccinees with regards to some of these more transmissible variants. And so the solution for these issues around vaccine effectiveness waning, as well as immune evasion for the variants of concern, is to offer booster doses. It's hard to predict currently the frequency at which these booster doses will be required, but we do know as we follow cohorts over time and watch for breakthrough infections that we would have more information around this in the near future. Here's a slide that shows the effectiveness durability by outcomes of the 3 authorized and/or approved vaccines in the United States. These 3 outcomes that were looked at in this study are COVID-19 infection, hospitalization, and death. This was based on an observational study in North Carolina involving almost 10.6 million individuals. And so what this study shows certainly is that over time, there appears to be a little bit of a drop in the vaccine effectiveness in preventing against infection. The mRNA vaccines by Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna seem to have a slight edge with regards to the vaccine effectiveness, both immediately post-vaccination up to 2 months and then declining to varying degrees over time. However, even at 5 to 6 months for the J&J vaccine and up to 8 months follow-up for the mRNA vaccines, you still see at least above 70% vaccine effectiveness in preventing against infection. The other 2 figures to your right show even more robust results regarding vaccine effectiveness impacting the more serious consequences of the disease. When we look at outcomes such as hospitalization and death, again, we see the vaccine providing robust protection even many months out post-vaccination. However, I will state that these data were accrued primarily during the Delta wave. This study looks at the effective durability stratified by age group, and we know this is critical because we realize that older individuals, specifically those older than age 65, tend to show a little bit lower antibody responses to vaccinations and potentially may experience a little bit lower clinical effectiveness. So this was the vaccine effectiveness over time stratified by age for recipients of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, Moderna, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I think across the board of these 3 figures, you can clearly see that individuals age greater than 65 in the red line appear to experience lower vaccine effectiveness relative to other cohorts, though the differences were marginal. Again, I think this highlights the fact that there may be a role for differential recommendations for the elderly regarding boosters compared to younger individuals. This is an interesting slide from the CDC that generated data during both the Delta and the early Omicron era. This was data from adults in the United States from about 25 US jurisdictions. And this really looked at the impact of vaccination status on incidence of COVID-19 as described by COVID-19 cases, which were laboratory confirmed cases, and also looking at deaths from COVID-19 over a period of time. This was data spanning May through December 2021. In red are individuals who are unvaccinated. In the broken green lines are those who are fully vaccinated. In the dotted green lines are those who are fully vaccinated but had not received a booster. And in the red broken lines are those who are fully vaccinated with a booster. And so the unvaccinated in the unbroken red and the fully vaccinated with a booster in the broken red lines. And if we look at the trend lines over time, we see a hump during the Delta wave for each group. However, we see that there was much more significant number of cases and deaths among those who were unvaccinated compared to those who were fully vaccinated. And as we proceed towards the emergence of the Omicron variant, which happened around December 2021, we do see some increase in cases among all groups, but still see that separation between the unvaccinated and vaccinated. It was a little too early to adjudicate deaths, given that we know that deaths follow cases by 3 to 4 weeks or so. However, we do see, again, still that maintained separation between the vaccinated and unvaccinated. So in general, there was about a 5 times higher risk of infection in the unvaccinated compared to the vaccinated. And there was actually a 94% effectiveness against death when you compare deaths among the unvaccinated compared to the vaccinated. Both of these showing robust protection that the vaccines confer in these real-world settings around preventing cases and deaths. Here is now some of the neutralizing efficiency against various concern following 3 doses versus 2 doses of a messenger RNA vaccine. These are very important lead-in data because prior to generating evidence on the clinical protection that these vaccines confer, some of the early signals of how well they would do are some of these laboratory data. However, we always state that laboratory data does not always correlate with clinical outcomes, but at least these give us a glimpse of how these vaccines are able to modulate immune responses and to provide protection against variants of concern. And so this was the neutralized study looking at the neutralizing efficiency of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine against the wild-type SARS-CoV-2 virus and the Beta, Delta, and Omicron variants of concern. And they looked at sera from individuals who had received 2 doses versus 3 doses of the vaccine. As you clearly see for recipients of the 2 doses, and just with the caveat that the individuals who received the 2 doses, these were sera obtained a median of 165 days, so roughly about 5 months post-primary series. The horizontal red line represents the detection limit of the neutralizing assay. And so what they found was that when you checked for neutralizing titers, clearly individuals had detectable neutralizing titers against the wild-type virus after receiving 2 doses. However, when you look at the variants of concern, both Beta, Delta, and Omicron, you can see that majority of measurements fell below the limit of detection of their test. And also, you can see a difference between the Beta and Omicron strains showing greater immune evasion against neutralization by the sera. However, after individuals received 3 doses of the vaccine, you can clearly see all 4 variants of the virus exceed the line of detection and having much more robust responses to the wild type and Delta as compared to Beta and Omicron. But you can clearly see that the 3rd dose certainly boosted the neutralizing titers against the variants of concern, which was quite encouraging. This is the effectiveness of the 3rd dose of the mRNA, and also looking at the waning protection of 2 doses. So this looked at vaccine effectiveness, both by the number of doses received, 2 doses versus 3 doses, and the timing of the doses. The outcomes here, we're looking at emergency department or urgent care visits or hospitalizations. And the vaccine effectiveness are highlighted by the percentages above the bar charts. So let's look to the left, and we can see that during the era of Delta predominance, for those who received 2 doses, you can see a drop in effectiveness against emergency department and urgent care visits in the darker blue, those who received 2 doses greater than 6 months earlier. Looking at those who received 2 doses less than 6 months earlier, effectiveness was much higher, again showing that temporal association between time post-primary series and vulnerability to infection. However, we see that there was much more robust protection for those who received the 3 doses. A similar pattern emerged for hospitalizations, where for those who received 2 doses greater than 6 months, protection was about 81%, and for those who had 3 doses, it was 94%. In the era of the Omicron predominance, you can see all those percentages down. Again, just highlighting that clinically, the immune evasion potential of Omicron reflected in clinical outcomes, such as requirements for hospitalizations and visiting healthcare settings. Even in this context, you still see that difference between those who were more than 6 months out from the primary series and those who were within 6 months of receiving the 2-dose series. And of course, the much more restored and much more robust protection against some of these medically attended visits and hospitalizations among those who've received the 3rd dose. So, take-home point is that timing matters post-primary series and informs the need for boosters, and that when individuals are boosted, that you can see a restoration of vaccine effectiveness, including against variants of concern. This study looked at heterologous approach or homologous approach, and looked at neutralizing antibody response. It had heterologous, meaning that everyone here got a 2-dose primary series of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and then they were either boosted with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine or the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. And this occurred roughly about 6 months or more after completing the primary series of the 2-dose vaccines. And they looked at neutralizing antibody responses to both the wild type as well as the Delta variant and the Beta variant. The Delta variant shown in light green and the Beta variant showed in dark green. And they analyzed these neutralizing antibody responses at day 0 study enrollment, but they followed them out to week 2 and week 4. We can clearly see that after receiving the dose, starting from 2 weeks later, you see an increase in the neutralizing antibody titers. For Johnson & Johnson, that increase continues through week 4. However, for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, that appears to peak earlier at 2 weeks and then starts to go down somewhat at week 4. So this study suggested that either one of these strategies did boost neutralizing antibody responses, including to variants of concern, but there were different peak times for Johnson & Johnson peaking at 4 weeks, while for Pfizer-BioNTech, it tended to peak at 2 weeks. And then the study also looked at cellular immune responses, looking at the CD8 and CD4 T-cell responses, both to the original strain as well as the Delta and Beta variants as shown. And in the figures, they look at data up to 2 weeks post-boost immunization, and again, comparing J&J boosting to Pfizer boosting. In general, there was a boosting of T-cell responses, be it CD8 or CD4. But what we can clearly see, again, it's hard to compare data from one vaccine to another, but it appeared that the J&J vaccine had an edge specifically regards to CD8 T-cell responses. And it's been, mentioned in studies, just the advantage of T-cell immunity in that T-cells tend to recognize variants of concern much more broadly. Now, here's a very fascinating data that we all learned from South Africa, which was a large healthcare worker study. This was looking at vaccine effectiveness of a Johnson & Johnson homologous booster dose. So this is a second dose of Johnson & Johnson vaccine given roughly about 6 to 9 months after the initial dose. Again, this is a homologous vaccine approach. Individuals getting the second dose of Johnson & Johnson vaccine after receiving initial dose with a time frame between vaccinations being about 6 to 9 months. They list the national data, but also Gauteng, which was an epicenter of the Omicron outbreak, such that we could specifically look to see how well these vaccines were performing in an area where Omicron was the predominant circulating strain. This was important data because you remember that this strain emerged in that region of the world between Botswana and South Africa. And this was really some of the early data that we needed to guide us to better understand the significance of this variant of concern. And so in the national data, they looked at vaccine effectiveness over time and found that, within the first 2 weeks post-booster vaccination, effectiveness was about 63% against hospitalization, climbing to 84%, 14 to 27 days, and still remaining flat at 85% 1 to 2 months later. In the area where they had an epicenter, in the less than 14 days, they found 93%, but they already started to see a bit of a waning of protection, about 81% against hospitalization in the 14 to 27 days. This suggests, again, some robust protection of the booster, even against the variant of concerns, with numbers that start to even approach some of the vaccine effectiveness we saw in clinical trials 2 months afterwards. However, a bit of the waning of immunity, especially in the epicenter of the Omicron outbreak, raises concerns about the durability of protection that these boosters confirm. So in the United States, for the J&J vaccine, based on risk-benefit analysis, what we know about heterologous booster data, and also with consideration for the peculiar, although rare, adverse effects associated with J&J vaccine, mRNA vaccines are preferred as a booster dose for individuals who receive the primary series of J&J. However, there have been guidance as to what candidates we may consider for J&J boosters, and these include individuals who have contraindications or severe allergies to mRNA vaccines, limited access to mRNA vaccines, or patient choice or preference. We've talked about vaccine effectiveness waning over time. And so, as you can imagine, there's been interest in administering a 4th dose of mRNA against Omicron. And we know that one of the lead countries that's been doing a large population-based evaluation of some of these booster doses is Israel. And they started to administer 4 doses of Pfizer vaccine to older individuals who were above the age of 60. And their sample size was about 1.1 million individuals. And these individuals received the 4th dose of a vaccine. And individuals in these studies had to have at least received their 3rd dose 4 months or more prior to receiving a 4th dose. And so what they did is that they tried to calculate out the rate ratio of confirmed infection and severe illness for those recipients of 3rd dose compared to those of a 4th dose. So this was a rate ratio. And so they looked at different time points, and they found that 12 days after the 4th dose compared to 3rd dose, that they had a lower confirmed infection rate by a factor of 2 and lower severe illness by a factor of 4.3. And then if you looked at 12 days or more after the 4th dose as compared to within the first week after the 4th dose, you saw about a 2-fold reduction in confirmed infection, and the rate of severe illness was lower by a factor of 4, suggesting that the peak effectiveness of the vaccine occurred at least 12 days or more after vaccination. These are the current guideline recommendations for primary vaccination series for the booster population. Remember that only the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is authorized for individuals aged 5 to 11 years and approved for those at 12 to 18 years. Moderna and Johnson & Johnson are also approved for 18 years and older. The primary series is 2 doses for the mRNA vaccines, as we all know, and a single dose for the J&J. And individuals receiving 2 doses of mRNA for those 12 years and older for Pfizer and BioNTech, and those 18 years and older should be anything from 3 to 8 weeks for Pfizer and 4 to 8 weeks interval between the 1st and 2nd dose. We do know about the data suggesting that longer dosing intervals may be associated with much more robust response. The J&J vaccine was administered as a single dose. For kids aged 5 through 11, again, the 3-week interval dosing is what's currently recommended for now as we continue the studies of younger kids within the clinical trials. For those who are 12 years and older and those who are 18 years and older who received the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines, as long as they're 5 months or more out from the primary series, they're eligible to receive at least a dose of a booster vaccine. Pfizer-BioNTech dose is the same booster dose as is given for the original primary series. In the Moderna, it's about 50 micrograms compared to the 100 microgram dose that's given as the primary dose series. For those who receive Johnson & Johnson, as we presented in the previous slide, an mRNA vaccine booster is recommended at least 2 months out from the primary series.
I think there is this perception in the general public that because Omicron seemed to be more mild for individuals, that this is inevitable. So I wanted to get your thoughts on the risks of these additional variants of concern that may emerge in populations, especially like the United States, that do have a lot of immunity, from vaccines or from infection. What do you think about the risks to the population as these additional variants will show up?
A mutation can either preserve the integrity of the architecture of the spike protein or distort it. If it preserves the integrity of the spike protein, then our current vaccines will probably be effective against it. But if there were a distortion of that architecture, then all bets are off, and we may need to develop new vaccines, or we may need to accelerate boosting.
So do you think we should have, prepare in the future for variant-specific boosters, or do you think we should, plan to continue with perhaps additional boosters of the ones that we have, like has been kind of our procedure to date?
We know that some variants are more immune evasive than others, which is why the question is relevant. But we also see that even where you use vaccines targeting the original strains, that you're able to restore protection even against these immune evading variants with regards to boosting. And then the question then comes that if we then produce a vaccine that's variant specific, and the future variants emerge, like Dr. Vermund mentioned, there's no guarantee that those ones will still not be susceptible. And there's a little bit of chasing a tail here because, there's no way of predicting what variant is going to come. And so, you'll be producing a booster many months after a variant has emerged without knowing what the future landscape would be. Some good news is that there are a lot of work going on to be able to develop vaccines that are not just variant specific, but are able to actually be more effective across all variants, so-called pan-coronavirus vaccines, some of which have already entered into phase 1 clinical trials. I think that that might be a little more prudent approach to preparing for the next variant rather than pursuing variant-specific boosters.
Thank you. And do you think if at some point this stabilizes and maybe we don't see these constant popping up of important new variants, that this may be something like we see with influenza, where you just go in the fall and you get your regular influenza shot and a coronavirus shot yearly?
Absolutely. I think that, we will transform from an epidemic phase to an endemic phase at some point. And if we can all settle on accepting an endpoint, which is that the vaccine should protect against hospitalization and death, because I think the durability of achieving that outcome is much more longer than, let's say, an outcome that's infection based. And so I think if that's the case, an annual booster may make sense. But again, it's still hard to predict what the trajectory of the COVID-19 pandemic will be at this time.
Let's talk a little bit about mix and match vaccination strategies. If you use the same vaccine for successive doses, we call that homologous. But if you use a different type of vaccine, we call that heterologous. The mix and match strategy using heterologous vaccines has proven to be very promising, and we'll get into some details in a moment. It seems to provide improved immunity against variants of concern. And the greatest benefit is seen when you mix different mechanisms of action. For example, if you mix two mRNA vaccines, like the Moderna or the Pfizer, there isn't a huge difference. But if you mix completely different types of vaccines, you may get substantial benefit. And we haven't seen any safety concerns beyond what we see with homologous use. Now, there is work that's been done taking the 3 licensed products in the US among fully vaccinated persons and then trying heterologous and homologous boosters. This is what the trial design looked like, and you can see that all combinations were used for all 3 of the products. And the heterologous boosters were better than the homologous boosters, 6 to 73-fold compared to 4 to 20-fold. But it wasn't the same for each combination. The greatest benefit was for the people who had the J&J primary vaccine. The use of the mRNA booster was especially beneficial in those individuals. The spike-specific CD8 T cell responses increased in all of the groups except the J&J homologous group, and therefore all people who got the J&J product are now being recommended to have the mRNA booster. So don't despair, J&J recipients. You will get a marvelous immune response, but you are advised to have the mRNA booster, to have a heterologous booster. Now, there are a number of other vaccine trials. Some of them have been done outside the US, some of them locally. And we see that using an mRNA booster has some similar effects as when it was given to the J&J recipients. Perhaps the most widely used vaccine in the world has been the inactivated vaccine produced by 2 Chinese companies, Sinopharm and Sinovac. And it turns out that if you give the mRNA either as a second dose or also as a booster, you can substantially increase antibody levels. And that's important global information because 2.5 to 3 billion people have gotten the inactivated product to date. Now, there are 2 emerging protein-based vaccines whose data are being presented to the FDA. One produced by Novavax and one produced by a partnership between Sanofi and GlaxoSmithKline. And so stay tuned as to whether these protein-based vaccines are approved for use in the US. Dr. Ogbuagu mentioned the pan-coronavirus vaccines that we would use against multiple variants of concern. And Walter Reed National Military Medical Center has announced phase 1 testing of a pan vaccine. And then there are other institutions that are listed here. Finally, we have the intranasal vaccines that theoretically would stimulate more local mucosal immunity at the actual site where the virus is entering us, namely the respiratory tract and the oral cavity. And there are some theoretical advantages to locally induced vaccination as long as you get your mucosal immunization as well as systemic immunization. And there are a whole host of products that you can see here that may be able to be effective in intranasal vaccines. And we all know the breakthrough in influenza, where that is now a product available.
You mentioned, physicians who may have international patients or patients who have gotten those vaccines, different vaccines that are not authorized in the United States and in another country. So how should those be handled? What suggestions would you have for clinicians who are seeing patients like that?
There is a very strong argument to vaccinate them with the mRNA product. If they've gotten mRNA product previously, you can consider them very much like you consider a US individual. If they've gotten the AstraZeneca, you can consider them very much as if they had gotten the Johnson & Johnson product. And if they got the inactivated products that I mentioned, produced by China for the most part, and to a lesser extent by Russia and India, then we would be a little more concerned because we haven't seen quite the robust immune response. They do seem to be pretty good at preventing hospitalization and death. So by no means are they useless vaccines. They've proven beneficial, but those individuals we know would benefit immensely from an mRNA booster. Dr. Ogbuagu, would you like to add?
No, I think one of the concerns initially was we didn't have data on heterologous approaches. I mean, as data continues to unfold, we've started to see that heterologous approaches can have some advantages, but they're safe, which is most important. So that's certainly no harms to boosting people or revaccinating people where you have concerns about a vaccine that was received in a foreign country.
And that brings us to, what responsibilities does the United States have? We talked a little bit earlier, very briefly, about global vaccine equity. And is that something where the United States should just be producing more of our vaccines that are authorized here and sending them elsewhere? Should we be funding some of these other ones that are not yet authorized in the United States, but are already being used in other countries? What are your thoughts on what we should be doing to try to assist others around the globe who don't have current access to vaccinations?
It is a fact that until we can better capacitate low and middle income countries to produce vaccines in closer to home, that vaccine costs will remain high and they will be dependent on donor country support. So to stimulate vaccine independence, if you will, and improve local capacity, it would be very important to have, for example, on the African continent, capacity to manufacture vaccines effectively and safely. So that is an excellent medium-term goal. In the short term, it's easier simply to ship vaccines and distribute them. So I would believe that both would be advisable. Work on the short term as well as working on the medium term.
Anything else to add?
No, just to double down on the fact that, some parts of the world have really under-vaccinated. I think even in Africa currently, there's across all countries, is still probably under 15% that are vaccinated. And if there's any incentive for countries like ours to have resources, I think we need to remember that where virus continues to circulate, it will mutate. And that then serves as a threat to all of us. So there's our collective destinies are in this. And I think that the more we can get vaccines and halt transmission in any part of the world, I think we all stand to benefit.
Absolutely. All right, and I think it's back to you for vaccination of special populations.
For the next series of slides, we'll be looking at vaccinations of special populations. And one of the special populations we're going to start with are immune-compromised patients. We do know that they've always been concerned about both the response from an immune standpoint to vaccinations, but also how well clinically these vaccines will protect individuals who, by virtue of the status of the immune system, may not be able to mount sufficient and robust responses to vaccines. And while in some of the initial trials we saw robust efficacy, many of those trials tended to exclude individuals with immune compromising conditions. And interestingly, there have been a ton of studies. The figure on the right shows a summary of a systematic review of 157 such studies among individuals who had some form of immune compromise. And this is a fascinating figure because they're looking at people who had no response, as defined as people who got vaccines and had no detectable anti-spike protein antibody, and looking at those who responded who were any detectable response. And you recognize that any response necessarily may not rise to the threshold that should provide protection. So this is fascinating. So here in this figure, in green are the highest rates of non-response, and in the lighter green or bluish is the lowest rate of non-response. And the different categories of immune compromised patients are as listed. Anything from those with underlying hematologic malignancies, cancers, people who are on hemodialysis, and people with autoimmune disease. Remember that many times that the immune compromise can be conferred both by the condition and the treatment for the condition. For example, when you look at hematologic malignancies, you see a spread from anything from 14% of individuals not responding to as high as 61%. In one study in solid organ transplant people, 100% of individuals did not have a response to the vaccines. So these data are quite compelling and really show very clearly that among certain immune compromised patients, that vaccine responses are pretty low. And we know that this has informed additional doses for individuals in this group. Here is just a listing, by no means exhaustive, of those who are considered immune compromised. I consider these group a heterogeneous group. For example, we know that individuals with HIV infection who are well controlled and have great CD4 counts are very different from individuals who have advanced HIV infection or untreated HIV infections and or have low T cell counts. We know that people who are recipients of solid organ transplants, even temporarily, those who are within, let's say, 6 months post-transplant, I guess those who are many years transplants, by virtue of the degree of the immune suppression, can be very different when it comes to vaccine responses. So even though we pull these individuals together as immune compromised, you recognize the different degrees of immune deficiency. And so you see words thrown about as, moderate or severe primary immune deficiency. But in general, I think providers should be aware that this is a group where, even though they're fully vaccinated, could still be vulnerable to COVID-19 infection and severe disease outcomes. And hence, even some of the public health recommendations for individuals who are immune compromised to still consider some precautions, even post-vaccination. And so the strategy, obviously, to address some of the concerns about the suboptimal or poor responses or non-responses in some cases to the primary vaccine series is to administer a third dose. And so the current recommendation is that those who are moderately severe immune compromised should receive, we're not talking about a booster dose, they're receiving an additional third dose, followed by a fourth dose as recommended. The CDC recently updated their guidance for people aged 12 years and older who are immune compromised to receive a second booster dose as long as they're 4 months out from the first booster dose. So we're moving from 3-dose primary series to 4-dose primary series for those with immune suppressive conditions and with good reason. And so here's just a tabular presentation of what we just discussed around the current guidelines. And this table shows the primary vaccine series stratified by vaccine received and the age group recommendation, and also the booster doses recommendations, as well as the intervals suggested. Just in summary, I think for individuals who received mRNA vaccine series and are moderately severely immune compromised, their primary series is 3 doses. And for those who are 12 years through 18 and 18 years older for the Moderna vaccine, eligible to receive a 4th dose as long as they're 3 months out from their primary 3-dose series. For those who are recipients of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, remember we've talked about an mRNA vaccine as a second dose to complete their primary series. They're also eligible for a booster dose, preferentially a messenger RNA. And so now let's look at clinical outcomes. This is the impact of immune compromising conditions on vaccine effectiveness. And so to the left is looking at the proportion of people who are hospitalized who were identified as immune compromised or not immune compromised. And these were the so-called vaccinated who had breakthrough infection. And this occurred during the Delta predominant phase. And so when you look at individuals who were vaccinated, who were hospitalized in this study, you can see that 51% of them were immune compromised and 22% of those were not immune compromised. And then for those who are recipients of 3 doses, again, you still see somewhat that loss of protection against hospitalization, where for those who were vaccinated and tested positive, who were hospitalized, about 16% of them were immunocompromised. Again, without knowing the denominators here, is hard to compare, but at least we then see that the immune compromised people are overrepresented proportionally in regards to being vaccinated and ending up hospitalized when they get effectiveness. And then also to the right, we're looking at vaccine effectiveness, now comparing vaccinated individuals to unvaccinated individuals. And this is protection against hospitalization with or without immune compromising conditions. So this provides a nice way to evaluate the protection conferred by 2 doses or 3 doses of the vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization, again, in an era where Delta variant was predominant. So we see for recipients of the 2-dose vaccine, effectiveness against hospitalization was 69% immune compromised, as against 82% in those who were not immune compromised. For those who received 3 doses, again, 88% among 2-dose vaccinees versus against 3 doses. So again, we see much more robust protection, both in immune compromised as well as non-immune compromised populations. Another special population that we're paying attention to is pediatric patients. We saw that when the new variant emerged and also newer variants of concern emerged and vaccination rates adults had taken off, we found somewhat of a skew of infections towards kids. And at some point, 1/3 of new COVID-19 cases in the country were occurring in individuals under the age of 19, reflecting what infectious diseases do, which is they seek out the unvaccinated and perpetuate infection among that group, and also debunking the myths that children were left unscathed with the pandemic. And so not just the concern about COVID-19 infection, but a significant condition that occurs in individuals many weeks after they're infected, which is a multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, which can be a really severe multi-organ illness that can be quite devastating for some children. And that tends to be a lag indicator of COVID-19 cases, even among children, given that lag time in which it tends to occur. And so we know that for children aged 5 and 11, it was disheartening that COVID-19 made it to the top causes of death in the US. And to date, there appears to be about 2,300 and counting cases of children among 5 through 11. We do know that even among children and adolescents, that the benefits of vaccination far outweigh the known and potential risks in those age groups. So we know that Pfizer-BioNTech is currently only vaccine recommended for children and adults. That might change in the near future as we generate more data from the Moderna vaccine study, for example. But here's the recommendations for children. The Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is authorized for those 5 through 11, approved for those 12 years and older. It's a 2-dose primary vaccine series. The recommended intervals are there. And then for those greater than 12 years of age, a booster dose is recommended. Remember that given the tiered approach that we've taken with regards to decreasing age of eligibility for vaccine, the older than 12-year population, for those who've been vaccinated, they've already spent many months post-primary series and should be eligible for the booster. I will not be surprised if subsequently in the future that additional doses are recommended for younger kids. For moderately to severely immunocompromised, I think we mentioned that the primary series is a 3-dose vaccine series for those individuals. The 3rd dose should be at least 4 weeks or more from completing the first 2 doses. And then for those age greater than 12 who are moderately severely immune compromised, there's a booster dose recommendation if you're 3 months or more out from your primary 3-dose series. And so then we now ask the question, what is the effectiveness of these vaccinations in preventing hospitalization and that the complication of multi-system inflammatory syndrome that occurs in children? And this looked at data for age 12 to 18 years. There's this phenomenon of antibody-dependent enhancement, and we see it in infections such as dengue fever, for example, where the first infection may be mild, but the subsequent infection may be severe. The second infection may be severe, and one of the postulated hypotheses is that this is driven by, exuberant antibody responses and inflammation. And so there have always been concerns about looking at the effect of vaccines as well, if there could be any relationship with the multi-system inflammatory syndrome that occurs in children as well. And so this was CDC data looking at hospitalizations, again, primarily during the Delta wave from June to September 2021. Obviously, they followed MIC for 3 months longer. Remember, we said MIC lags behind hospitalizations and disease. They found that for COVID-19 hospitalizations in this age group 12 to 18, the vast majority of hospitalizations occurred in those who were unvaccinated, that we could expect. And also the vast majority of MIC cases occurred in the unvaccinated, 95%. And so if you look at the figures to the right, the bars, and they stratified the patients here by age, so those 12 to 15 or 16 through 18, very robust vaccine effectiveness against COVID-19 hospitalization, and pooled data showed a 91% effectiveness against MIC. If the vaccines were associated with MIC, this data will look totally different. And remember that for individuals who are hospitalized, almost 17% of these were critically ill. For those who had MIC, almost 4 out of 10 were critically ill. And so these are not unconsequential outcomes in kids. And I think these lend serious support for vaccinating children within these age groups. Just want to highlight that there are ongoing trials for pediatric patients. Pfizer and Moderna have active trials for infants and children from age months to less than 5 years. We do think that children born to vaccinated mothers do enjoy some protection from passive transfer of maternal antibodies. EUA application for Pfizer-BioNTech was considered at some point, but the decision by the FDA delayed because of the suboptimal immunogenicity between the less than 5-year age group, although the immunogenicity bar was met for 6 months through less than 2 years. And frankly, as expected, that a 2-dose series at that time was going to perform lowly with Omicron era. Moderna also has reported some data on their efficacy among kids and immunogenicity for a booster dose, and we'll learn more about that in the near future. We do know that Johnson & Johnson also has trials ongoing for kids aged 12 through 17.
So that's a lot of information. So maybe we can distill a few things down for people listening. So when it comes to dosing considerations in some of these special populations, do you want to just summarize what they should be thinking about first, immunocompromised patients?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, for immune-compromised patients, the concern was the response to the vaccines, as we've shown, and matching both the poor immune responses to what appears to be some, loss of vaccine effectiveness among those patient populations. And so I think those really provided, and also some data that suggested that if you gave additional doses to some individuals, and sometimes it wasn't just one additional dose, sometimes 2 additional doses requiring to so-called rescue individuals who had no antibody responses. And so I think that that's, on solid ground and informed the requirements for immune-compromised patients to receive extra vaccine doses.
And then when we talked about pediatric patients, we're not talking yet, at least, about additional doses, but for some of those groups, there are different amounts of mRNA in those shots, right? So, so can we talk a little bit about how that may affect how well the vaccines work? How did we arrive at those?
Yeah, so for some vaccines, we use the same doses for adults as we use for kids, and sometimes there's a difference between the vaccines. And I know for the mRNA vaccines, these were just a novel vaccine approach, so it's really no clear pre-existing data on guidance for that. And I think there was some concern at some point for concern about some of the myocarditis episodes that happened, the messenger RNA, and if that could have been triggered by somewhat higher doses like we saw in, the younger men, for example. And so the doses for kids were arrived after very careful selection based on earlier phase clinical trials, where there were dose ranging studies that looked at anything from the adult dose to much more lower doses among the age groups. And I think they were calibrated, the selected dose was calibrated based on the immune responses to those different doses, as well as the safety observations regarding to both local and systemic side effects. So there's a lot of careful work done with dose selection, and that's how, for example, Pfizer arrived at a third dose for 5 years and older and a 10th of the adult dose for kids 6 months and above.
Hey, and while we're on the kids vaccine, can we talk about what is known about approval for under fives? Because I know a lot of both pediatricians and parents are anxiously awaiting those vaccines. So either of you, do you have any insights on when those might be expected for FDA authorization?
Well, we were pretty close just weeks ago, and there were some disappointing results. So they had to go back to the drawing board to look at dosing. These are bridging studies. You don't have to recruit 30,000 kids the way we did for adults. These are what we call bridging studies. So they're much smaller studies relying on immunogenicity and reactogenicity. Immunogenicity, how much of an immune response is stimulated. Reactogenicity is how much reaction you have, side effects to the vaccine. And we already have considerable data in the children under 5. So getting the vaccine right in terms of dosing is what they're doing now. And I think it's a matter of just a month or two before they will be prepared to resubmit to the FDA.
Yeah, so in the Pfizer trials, we're currently enrolling kids aged 6 months to less than 5 years. And now we've shifted from a 2-dose trial to 3-dose. And let me just clarify that it's not just the immune responses. I think we were studying this dosing in a time where there was a variant of concern that if you did immunity, so that 2 doses weren't going to cut it, regardless of the response anyway. So I think some of it is unfortunately a victim of timing and the circulating variant at the time, but we'll see what the results, as you rightly said, Dr. Vermund, around a third dose, getting the dosing right, and hopefully in the next month or two, there should be some data that can go back to the FDA.
Thank you. And then moving back to adults, so we just had an update from the CDC on March 29th, 2022, about a recommendation for a second booster dose. Can you discuss who is affected by that or who should be getting another booster?
The older you are, the more likely you will benefit from the second booster, because Dr. Ogbuagu's slide was crystal clear that you had somewhat suboptimal durability of immune response if you were older. Now, a decline in antibody levels doesn't always correlate with less benefit, but it is a surrogate, and we're trying to be cautious. So that's why folks 65 and over, or even 50 and over, should seriously consider that second booster to maximize their protection against emerging variants and circulating virus. Now, anyone with a comorbidity, diabetes most notably, but also cardiovascular disease, battling cancer, that would be advisable. And then Dr. Ogbuagu also highlighted special consideration for immunosuppressed individuals, who many of whom may have gotten a second booster already. So he may wish to comment on that.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add beyond that, but you rightly said that individuals 12 years and older who have immune compromised constitution would benefit from having a fourth dose. I will say that we've seen that vaccine uptake among younger people tends to be a little more lower than those for adults. So I'm hoping that the message gets out and that the guidance is clear enough for the public to assimilate and recognize who among us needs to go get an additional dose.
And so this brings us toward the end. So in summary, we do have 3 SARS-CoV-2 vaccines that are currently available in the US. So Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson currently. They've demonstrated high efficacy and effectiveness, reducing infection rate, disease severity, hospitalizations, and mortality. And they have similar safety and efficacy in patients with comorbidities as well. The variants of concern have led to the implementation of these booster doses that we have just discussed. We've also discussed mix and match strategy that does seem to have greater success against some of these variants of concern, and discussed this heterologous versus homologous boosting. In immunocompromised patients, it is recommended to get an additional primary dose. In pediatric patients, it is clear that the benefits of vaccination outweigh the risks. Pfizer-BioNTech is currently the only vaccine that is authorized for children and adolescents. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today. Please make sure to claim your CME credits by completing the post-test and evaluation form at the link on the screen, and make sure to follow Bottom CE on Twitter and stay tuned for more COVID-19 vaccine content.